Good morning.
Good morning.
Daf Yomi I'm in base. And we had seen the 5 levels of an earthenware vessel becoming a non-vessel in regards to Tumah, and the 5 levels of that. We saw that a vessel, there's the first level is the liquid in it will run out, and that's enough of a hole for which is a piece of clay, a shard, a broken piece of an earthenware vessel that's usually used as a plug or a cover. And so if somebody had a nice jug and they had a hole in it, so they would put this piece of clay in a shard to seal the hole. But if that's also leaking, they would toss that. So that's not a vessel anymore. The second level is where you have something that water can seep in. So that's going to lose its level of vessel in regards to receiving the water, having the water of the red heifer water of the Mayim Chaim for the Paraduma, Mechatas. The third level, if it has a hole, it has a hole the size of an olive. That's going to make it not a vessel in regards to whatever tumah is olive size. And we have, we had a shorish katan first, a small root, an olive size, and a pomegranate size. And pomegranate size, once it has a pomegranate size, that's large enough not to be a vessel for everything. Now the Gemara goes into the halacha is that you had an earthenware vessel in a home, in an earthenware vessel in a house that there's a deceased person. So now all the vessels that are in the house, that the ol hameis, the house, the room, the under the same cover that the deceased person is at, and all the vessels are going to be tummy. But if you have an earthenware vessel that's sealed, meaning since earthenware vessels are only mekabel tumah on the inside, and you sealed it on the outside, it's completely covered, so then it's not going to be susceptible to tumah. However, if this earthenware vessel, even though that it's sealed on the top, has a hole on the side, and as Tues points out, of course, if it has a hole on the opening in the sealant, then any amount of a hole is going to be enough because it's not properly sealed. But if it has an actual break on the side, how much of a break on the side would count that now the vessel is susceptible to tumah on the inside, because the ol hameis, the atmosphere with this tumah in the room, would enter through that break. This is 6 lines from the bottom of Tzadi Hey Amid Base, 95b, just the last few words. And if this earthenware vessel is completely sealed, then it has to be that there's a crack, there's a break in the majority of the vessel in order for it to be susceptible to tumah, and the tumah would enter from its side. And as I said, of course, if the sealant at the opening is even a small hole, it'll be susceptible to tumah, it'll become tummy, on account of that's its main opening. But where it's supposed to be closed, it's supposed to be sealed, and there's a crack, there it'd have to be the majority of it. Amar Ravasi, shamatically cherishira kamatzirima. All right, Ravasi says that I heard that the measure for an earthenware vessel is the opening of a pomegranate size. Perhaps you're talking about where it's sealed on the top and there's a break on the side, the size of an opening for a pomegranate. So Gemara says, great, okay, but Rava just said that it's the majority. Not the size of a pomegranate, but rather until it is mostly it has a crack on the majority of it. He says it depends a larger vessel or a smaller vessel. Rashi says a larger vessel needs a break in the majority, and a smaller vessel needs a break of a pomegranate size. And therefore, Tues says, I don't know which is larger, which is smaller. So Tues says the other way around. It's the smaller of the two, meaning if a pomegranate size is more than the majority of, it's such a small vessel, the pomegranate size whole is more than the majority of the vessel, then you go by majority. However, if it's a large vessel, then even if it hits, as soon as it hits a pomegranate size, it's enough to make it open. Or Rashi says it's the other way around. Amar Ravasi. Ravasi said, Shonin, we learned the halacha that kli chereshira become an mashka. An earthenware vessel is enough that liquid can come in. However, the first level that we said, where that it can't contain liquid because liquid would seep out, that's only in regards to a gistera, which we said is a shard of clay. And that shard of clay is used, of an earthenware vessel is used as a plug. If somebody has a nice jug and there's a hole in it, and they don't want to toss it because the water is leaking out, so they would put in this shard of clay to cover that hole. But you wouldn't take a hole, a shard of clay that in itself is leaking, because then you're going to need a plug for the plug. So obviously that shard of clay is now useless, and that's the reason. My time, because nobody's going to bring a plug for a plug, a shard of clay to close up a hole for the shard of clay that has a hole. Amar Ula, Pliga Batrei Amarai. Ula says that there's a machlokas between the Amarayim. Rashi says this machlokas is in regards to what we saw earlier, that an earthenware vessel that has a plant in it, the food growing in that plant is going to be considered connected to the ground enough that it's not susceptible to tumah. Tues has a different way about this. So we have two opinions, which we saw earlier. Is going to be machlokas and how whether it's kamotzi the shorish cotton, the size of a small root. We saw an opinion of any hole versus a machlokas of Shimon and the Chachamim in the Mishnah. So that la'alacha Ula says that there are two Amarayim b'ma'arava in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Yosef Arav and Rav Yosef Arzavda. Chad Amar once said kamotzi riman. The hole in the potted plant has to be the size of a pomegranate in order for it to count as connected to the ground and the food growing there not be susceptible to tumah. Chad Amar Kasharish Kata once said no, it's sufficient in the smaller measure, which is like a small root. That's how small the hole is. Now, if you remember, we had three levels. We had two levels of drink liquid that can leak out, and that was on the shard of clay, and liquid that can get into a vessel. In regards to a vessel counting for the red heifer water, for the mechatas of paraduma. But in regards to a vessel losing its own status, in regards to tumah, we had three levels. The smallest level was that the hole was like a small root. The second was an olive size, and the third was a pomegranate size. Here we have the two extremes. One said that it needs the size of a pomegranate in order to count as connected to the ground, and the food growing in this plant, potted plant, not be considered connected to the ground and not susceptible to tumah. And the other said no, it's even as small as a small root. And the way to remember it is that there are two extremes. And we use a phrase that's used elsewhere in the Gemara several times in regards to somebody that echad amar be'echad amamid, regardless if you do a lot or a little, as long as you're intending for the right intentions to connect with Hashem, l'shamayim. So therefore, this term to tell us that one's taken into the largest size and one is taken to the smallest size. However, Rab China says that the measure of an olive size is what an earthenware vessel needs. Rashi says he's not disagreeing because he's not talking about the food growing in this potted plant susceptible to tumah, but rather in the vessel itself being susceptible to tumah. Tosfos has a different way. That they are now, this vessel, this earthenware vessel, which typically would be susceptible to tumah, now that it has an olive-sized hole in it, it is not susceptible to tumah in any manner. It's like kli glalim, kli avanim, kli adama, vessels made out of dung, vessels made out of clay, earth, and sand that would not be susceptible to tumah.
What does that mean? Even if there's some use for it, it still is not. Even though it has a use as a kli, you can't. It's got no susceptibility to tumah like a kli glalim.
Correct. And therefore, it's not susceptible to tumah. Not for as a even rabbinically, it's not susceptible to tumah. However, in regards to sealed vessels in a oil amace, in a tent where there's a deceased, it would be the majority of the vessel, like we saw earlier in the name of Rava. And Rashi points out, even though that the Gemara tells us elsewhere, we learned that it's a Mishnah in Kalim, that a vessel susceptible to tumah until it has a hole the size of a pomegranate. That's talking about wood vessels. But an earthenware vessel, an olive size is enough to make it not a vessel. With this, we complete Perek HaMatzniah. We begin Perek HaZorek. We should come back to you on Matzniah as a Shem. HaZorek Mershus Loshus. So we're going back to domains in carrying. And as we remember, there are 4 domains. There is a public domain, Reshus HaRabban, a private domain, an enclosed Reshus HaYachid. There is a Carmelis, something in between, and it's a rabbinic public domain. And we have a Makom Potter, a place that is not really a place of significance in halacha, and therefore it's Potter, you can actually carry in that place or put something down there. Somebody throws.
Why don't we mention in that list? Why don't we mention carpe? Why is not part of it?
Because it is just a own place. It's just a Carmelis, another nation for it, even though that it's enclosed. But it's essentially just a Carmelis. Tues talks about this earlier in the Masechah, but that's what it is. Okay, so Hazorek. Up until now, we were talking about somebody carrying. Now we come to the idea of somebody throwing. I want to introduce this beginning of this perek with a concept that we've seen multiple times, and it's very relevant to this stuff. And that is that with all other malachas, you're creating something, and that creation is definable. You weave, you write, you cut, you ignite a flame, you extinguish a flame. With carrying, you haven't really done anything. And so it is designated as called a malacha gerua, a diminished malacha, which is creative work. You haven't really created much. You've just moved something from one place to the next. And therefore, the Gemara constantly tells us that unless we know something is included in the prohibition, Tues is constantly saying on account of it being a part of the setup of the Mishkan. Rashi is saying because we have a drasha for it, we see it in the pasuk somehow, or we have a logical connection to say it's exactly the same. It would not count. Meaning, in all other malachas, we say that there's a concept of a tolda and of the av. If we have a principle and we have a subcategory, then the subcategory would count as a subcategory of the principle. Pruning counts as helping something grow, and therefore it's a subcategory. It's a tolda of planting, and we've seen many toldos already. Even though that it's not logically exactly the same, nor is it the exact act that is in the Avos Malachas, isn't what was done in the Mishkan. Nevertheless, it counts because it's creative and it's doing the same fundamental work. In carrying, it's not so. In fact, as you remember, in the first daf of Shabbos, we learned that in order to the Gemara had a question: why is carrying in the same as carrying out? And we had to say that to prove from the text of the Mishnah that that's the way that Mishnah saw it. That carrying something in from a public domain to a private domain is the same as carrying something from the public domain, private domain to the public domain, or vice versa, or as the Gemara calls it, hachnasa and hotzah, bringing in and taking out, are the same. We needed that because even though it should, in every other malacha that would be obvious, here we needed to discuss that because it's a malacha gerua. It is not a typical malacha, and therefore only that which was at the Mishkan and logically it fits in will count as the malacha. And therefore the Gemara is now going to go into throwing. So you carried something in that was in the Mishkan. Throwing something did not exist in the Mishnah, or did it? And therefore we have to tell you, does it count as carrying or not? And we'll see that sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Not in a necessarily logical way, simply based on was it in the Mishkan that way or not. Somebody throws from a private domain to a public domain, or vice versa. That counts as carrying. But if you throw from a private domain to another private domain, and in between is a public domain. So you throw it, you live on one side of the street, and your neighbor lives on the other side of the street, and you stand on your porch, your deck, your window, and you throw something across over the airspace of the public domain into the other house, onto their porch. That's going to count as Mershus HaYachid or Shus HaYachid, from a private domain to another private domain. However, in between there is a public domain. So Rabbi Akiva says Echayev. The Chachamim say you're exempt. Now, in order to understand that, we have to first address something that we saw in the first daf of the Masechta. That the halacha is a public domain only counts as public domain up to 10 tefachim, let's say 30 inches. And above that, the airspace is not public domain. So what's Rabbi Akiva talking about when he says that the chayiv? Is it above that space? And then we would say, nevertheless, it counts because kaluta kamisha horchadami, that once it's in the airspace, it's as if it's put on the ground, so it's as if it's below. Or do we only say that within the 10 tefachim? So this disagreement between the Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva, do we say this in above 10 tefachim or below 10 tefachim? That was a discussion we saw in the Gemara, in two versions in the Gemara way back at the beginning of the Masechta. Keitzad. So the Gemara says, okay, so what's the scenario? And Tues says that this version, the question, what's the scenario, is going to be dependent upon which explanation of Rabbi Akiva we have in the Gemara earlier. Is it above 10 tefachim or below? Either way, so they used to have a protrusion in the building on either side of the street without a porch there, but they would put planks down when they needed to use it as a porch. And sometimes they put a plank across the public domain to get across to the other side. So each house would have a little plank, a little ledge, and they would put a plank of wood down to get across. So shtei gzuz, these two protrusions, zu connected zu, one directly above the other, v'shus harabim, and they're out into the public domain. So hamoshet, if you pass something across to the other side, bazarik mizulazu, or if you throw from one to the other, Potter, you would be exempt. However, instead of it being across the public domain in between them, they're side by side, meaning it's not your neighbor across the street, but your neighbor on the same side of the street has this ledge or the porch, and there you're not throwing across the public domain, but rather you're throwing on the same side of the building, but in between is still public domain, because your porch, your ledge is out into the Rishus HaRabim. So even though that it's both on the same side, but when you pass along, the public domain will be there. Yeah, show that. There you go. So it's on the same side of the public domain, and because it's over the same side of the street, but since it's over the public domain, so the Rishus HaRabim is in between the two porches. Thank you, too. So in this case, if you pass it, chayiv, you're going to be transgressing. If you throw it, you'll be exempt. So this is counterintuitive. We would think if you pass something across public domain over from one side of the street to the other, it's worse. However, that's not the way it was in the Mishkan, as the Gemara is going to explain to us that the way they had the wagons set up, the wagons were set in a manner that that you passed from the same side, but not across. I'm not sure that that's instructive. Okay, so if you can see in the background there where Tuvia's finger is, there's the Mishkan. And as they took those beams down, the fellow right again up against the Mishkan would take the beam and pass it to the second wagon. And then there was another set of wagons, and the person there closest to the Mishkan would pass it to the second wagon. So they were all passing to their same side, but not across to the other side. In any case, even though it's counterintuitive, this is the halacha. If you're passing across a public domain, or if you're throwing across a public domain, you're not going to transgress carry. However, if you pass it to the same side, but there's a gap between the porches, and therefore it's the airspace of Rishus HaRabim of the public domain, passing would be chayiv. That's a Torah prohibition. Throwing it would be rabbinic, and you would not have to bring a sin offering for that.
Okay, one more time, though. I'm not sure. This gazustra is above 10 tefachim from the ground?
That's a machlokas in the Gemara earlier.
Right, but I mean, we said above 10 tefachim is makom potter, right?
Correct, but there's a concept there's a concept of kluta. Let's leave the height for now. The Gemara is not addressing that yet. Right now, let's just see the case. How high it is, or how is it in the airspace of Rishus HaRabim or not? Two versions. Let's leave that explanation for now. Let's just go that the concept. The concept is if I pass it across or I throw it across the street from one private domain to another private domain, my Rishus HaYachid, my porch, my house, to the other Rishus HaYachid, porch, house, ledge, whatever it may be, but it's large enough to count as a Rishus HaYachid, I'm exempt. I don't have to bring a sin offering, even though I did so, because it's not a Torah prohibition. However, if I pass it along on my side from my porch to the next, chayiv, that's going to be a Torah prohibition and a sin offering. If I throw it, it wouldn't be. That part good? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. But this plank, this gazustra is like a plank that's sticking. I would think about it as a balcony, but you're describing it as like just a ledge. Is that right?
It's a ledge that was used that you put a plank down as a balcony.
So it's a ledge that it's over, and it itself is over the Rishus HaRabim?
Yes.
So it's got a din of a Carmelist, or it's got a din of a Rishus HaYachid?
Rishus HaYachid, a private domain. It's large enough to be private domain.
So then the height's got to come into it, because otherwise... It's like a Karen Zovis in the Rishus Harabim. Why is it a?
No, it's above the ground.
Yeah.
And it's let's say it's the ledge off my porch. So I have a door there, and the door is open, so it's a part of the house, for example. However it is now a private domain, right? We saw many discussions in the first parak and earlier. What would make such a ledge Rishus Hayachid? Is it 4 by 4 by 10 tefachim, or the whatever the designation is? It's a private domain right now. So what's the reason? If this is counterintuitive, throwing across and passing across the public domain, Rishus Hayachid, Rishus Harabim, would not count as a Torah prohibition, but on the same side it would. So the Gemara explains, the Mishnah explains, because this is the way the Levim did in the Beis HaMikdash. In removing the Mishkan, the construction, so they had 4 wagons. They had 2 on the east side, and 2 on, this is on the east side, 2 on the southeast corner, and 2 on the northeast corner of the Mishkan. And everybody, as they were taking the beams off of the Mishkan, they would have to put it on these wagons. So the 2 wagons, one behind the next. Somebody was standing at the Mishkan, taking a beam down and putting it down on these wagons. But he would first pass it to the second wagon back, but on his side. But they wouldn't pass it to the other side because there was somebody there taking down the wagon. So it was all same side of the public domain. And as the Gemara is going to explain to us, that encampment area around the Mishkan was Rishus Harabim, because all of Am Yisrael, which were encamped around that, would walk into there to come to Moshe and to come to the Mishkan. And over there, they would pass things on the same side from one wagon to the next, but they wouldn't throw it, as it wouldn't be honorable to the Mishkan, to the beams, and it could damage them. So these beams were shtei agalos zu achazu. There were two wagons, one behind the other. Rishus Harabim, and it was in a public domain. But the wagons themselves were large enough to count as a private domain. Moshitin akrashim miziluzu, and therefore they would pass the beams from one to the next, and it's on the same side of the public domain. Avalazerkim, but they would never throw it. Now we turn the page to Tzadi Vavim and Beis, and the Gemara is going to analyze this as we said before. Mechti zurika told the hitzahi. Throwing is really a subcategory of carrying. Where do we know in the Torah carrying? Now, as we said earlier, all the other malachas, we never asked such a question. We didn't say, where do we know that writing is included? Because it was in the Mishkan, and we have 39 malachas. But hotzah, being that it's a malacha gerua, it's really non-creative, and therefore is a diminished level of malacha. We need a source for it in the Torah. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Yochanan says in the pasuk Vayitzav Moshe v'Yaviru kol b'machane. The Bnei Yisrael were donating and creating materials for the Mishkan, and Moshe sends out a message: cease. We have enough. There's plenty. Nobody should carry anything out and bring it. Now we have enough is message number one. Why did Moshe say not to carry it? He sent a message that nobody should bring any more stuff. So Moshe Heichen Haman, where was Moshe sitting? He was in the Levi encampment. As we know, the 12 tribes were sitting 3 on each side, east, west, north, and south, around in a square-like encampment. Each tribe, 3 on each side, and in the center was the Levium's open camp, and in the center of that was the Mishkan. So he was in the Levim's camp, which was the center area, the buffer zone between the 12 tribes encampment and the Mishkan. And that was a public domain because everybody, all the 600,000 plus Jews in the encampment would come in to either talk to Moshe, to go to the Mishkan. And he said, don't bring anything in, but Tesu will take anything out. The truth from your tent, which is a private domain, into the Levi camp. So you see Moshe Rabbeinu saying, don't carry from don't bring anything, don't carry. So the Gemara says, how do you know that was Shabbos? I'm a mind of Shabbos kai. Maybe it was a regular weekday. And why did he say don't bring it? Because it was already done and he didn't want to be left with leftover materials. Not because it was Shabbos and therefore don't carry it, but rather we're done. We don't need it anymore. As it says that there was enough work done, enough materials. So the Gemara says, no, we compare the term ha'avara, passing the message through, carrying it through. As it says over here, they brought a call through the camp. And in my Yom Kippur it says, and you will bring the call of the shofar through the camp. Just as over there it was on a prohibited day, so to here is a prohibited day on Shabbos. Fine. So we know taking out from your private domain, from your tent, to bring it to the Mishkan, which would cross the public domain, is prohibited. But how do I know bringing in as well? And even though in the first daf we said it is really the same, and the Mishnah there actually indicates that it's all called hotzah, carrying, taking it out of its domain to another domain. The Gemara here is asking, how do we know that? Svarahi. So it's logical. It's taking from one domain to the next. What difference would it make bringing in or taking out? However, the Gemara concludes, carrying it out would be the principle, and hotzah and achnasa, bringing it in, would be the subcategory. Mechti. So Gemara says, let's analyze that. Either one is a Torah prohibition, you're telling me. So then, am I karla hai av? Am I karla hai told? What distinction is there? What value is it in calling one the av and one the told, one the principal and one the secondary? Either way, it's going to be the same thing. So we're going to see two versions of this, which we already discussed a few times in passing, and here is going to be the principal point. That there's relevance to the halachas of based in holding someone accountable for breaking Shabbos. Nafkamina the Ovid shtei Ovis bahadi adadi nami shtei toldos bahadi adadi mechayev tarti. The Ovid av v'tolda didei lemechayev elachad. So the first version, the first explanation the Gemara says is there's a distinction in two. If somebody transgresses two principles of the 39 principles, two of us, so they cut a piece of parchment to size and begin to write on it. So cutting the parchment is cutting down to size, Korea, and writing. So those are two principles, two avos malachas, and they would have to bring two separate sin offerings, two chatos for each, one for each. Whereas if they did a subcategory of any one of those together with it, then that would not add a chatas. If they had two subcategories, so somebody pruned the tree, which is a subcategory of the subcategory of planting because it helps the tree grow, and they also needed this pruned twig for kindling. So they're also harvesting, as we saw a case earlier in the Masechta. They'd be chayiv two chatos, even though one is a subcategory and the other maybe a subcategory. Nevertheless, they would count as two. However, if somebody watered the plant and prune, which are both parts of planting, they would only be chayiv one chatas for the category and all of its subcategories of planting. So that's why it's important to know what's its own independent principle, av, and what is the tolda. Because if it's a tolda and you did it together with the av, so in this case, if somebody carried something from their tent out into the Levi camp and then back home, they would only have to bring one sin offering because they only did one transgression, even though they brought it out and brought it in. However, Rabbi Eliezer the Mechayim told him, my Kollel told him, but Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with this concept. He says it doesn't make a difference if you transgress the principle, you transgress the subcategory, the Av, the Tolda, and even the Av and Tolda of the same. Each action, each transgression needs its own chata. So for him, this is not a distinction. So what is the distinction? So my Kollel told that which was mentioned in the Mishkan, that which was done in the Mishkan counts as a principle, and that which was not done in the Mishkan, which is subcategory, counts as a tolda. And what relevance does it have? So Tues here explains the relevance is in regards to the warning. The halacha is that that in order for Beis Din to hold somebody accountable for anything, they have to have done it intentionally. And when they do it intentionally, they have to have been warned. They have to have two witnesses, and they have to be warned. The warning, the hasra warning, has to be done by mentioning the Torah prohibition and its punishment. So the person would have to say, don't do that because it is the prohibition of planting on Shabbos. And that is the principal category of pruning. So you see somebody pruning, you say, don't do that. That's considered planting on Shabbos, and that's a Torah prohibition. And they have to then say, I don't care. I'm doing it anyhow. That's when they can be brought to Beis Din. So, but if the person giving the warning, the hasra, mentions the wrong prohibition, that doesn't count. So over here, the necessity of knowing what is the principle, what is the subcategories, because if they mention the wrong principle, if that would not count, there's a discussion whether if they mention the subcategory, the tolda, that counts. But if they mention the wrong principle, the wrong av, it does not count. And that's why it's important to know what's the av. Whatever was in the Mishkan is the av. And the relevance would be that the Masra, the Hasra, would have to mention that particular av. Now the Gemara answers, "V'had Tanan Azarik Dal Ramas Bekosa Lamala Miyut Tvachim Kazarik Ba'avir Lamata Miyut Tvachim Kazarik Ba'aretz." Because the airspace of a Rishus Harabim, of a public domain, only goes up to 10 tefachim. If somebody throws something above the 10 tefachim, now we know once it lands, it's going to land on the ground, so that's going to be that's going to count as in the public domain, and so they're going to be chayiv. If it lands on top of something, so we're going to measure and see what it landed on. If it landed on a space that's large enough to be a private domain, it's going to count as private domain. If it's large enough, not large enough, then it's going to count as a carmelis. If it's tall enough, it could be and small enough, it could be a makom patur, an exempt area that you're actually allowed to put it down there. However, if it landed on the side, so it was something sticky, and you threw it against the wall, and it landed, and it sticks to the side of the wall. We had this case earlier in the Masechta. So he threw this, if it was above 10 tefachim, and it landed on the wall above 10 tefachim, that's going to count as not landing in the public domain. However, if he threw something within the 10 tefachim airspace, so it landed on the wall within the 10 tefachim of the airspace, since it landed on something, and it's within the airspace of 10 tefachim, it counts like it's in the public domain. Azarik be'aretz daled amos, or if somebody throws it just within the airspace of the public domain, Rishus Harabim, and it goes 4 amos, chayiv. All of these is going to be chayiv. Zarak daled amos Rishus Harabim minolan. How do we know this concept that throwing something within 4 amos, or not within, beyond 4 amos, 4 cubits, which is about, let's say, 6 feet in a public domain, is chayiv? Because those that were weaving the curtains would throw their needles to each other. So Gemara says, if they were weaving, why would they have needles? It means they were sewing them. They would throw their needles from one to each other because they were sewing different sides, and so they would sew here and then throw it to the other side. How do you know that they were sitting across the public domain? Maybe they were sitting on the same side. The Gemara says, can't be. Then they would poke each other with their needles. Okay, fine. So they weren't right near each other. But who tells you that they were 4 amos apart? Elo Amar Rav Chisda, so rather Rav Chisda said, Shekain Orge Yiriyas Zorkim Buchir B'Yiriyah. Rather, it's the people that were weaving. The weaving was done by throwing the buchir, the shuttle, across from one side to the other. So I just shared the screen with you, the picture of the weave of a loom, and you see the harnesses that would pick up the heddles, which picked up either every even number vertical thread or every odd number vertical thread, and then the spool of the horizontal thread would be in a shuttle on a stick on a shuttle, and then as you throw it across to the other side, as you can see here in the picture right where my cursor is, so as you throw it across to the other side, it releases some of the thread, sort of if you think of like a spool that you have when you're releasing a kite, that more thread comes off as you do so. So in this area, you see the shuttle, and it goes across, and so you throw it from one side to the other. So typically, it's one person per loom, and so they're using their left hand to the right hand. They're throwing across to the left hand and then back to the right hand, and for each one, they lift or drop the odd number or even number threads, and that each harness goes up and down. So this shuttle, throwing it across, but it was what they were doing. And that would be transferring from one side to the other. Now, normally it's a narrow shuttle, a narrow loom, and you're doing it to yourself. But these curtains had to be very large in size, and so the looms were much larger. And so the Gemara proposes maybe what was going on is that they were throwing it from one to the other, and that was across 4 amos. So that's this shuttle. Says so what? But he's still holding on to the string, to the thread on one side as he throws a spool across to the other fella on the other side, and so it's still in his hand, and that doesn't count as carrying or throwing because he's still holding on. So Benitzcha Basra. Let's talk about the last bit of thread on that spool, as that would release a release, and now the shuttle goes flying on its own. So what? It's still a makom pater because it's in the loom, within the confines of the loom, and that's not a public domain because it's not 4 amos wide, and therefore it counts as its own domain. So rather is they were throwing the shuttle to their assistants. Maybe they were near each other. No, they wouldn't be, because they would poke each other in their clothing. They would get into each other. Maybe they were near each other, but they were set back a little. So they were within 4 amos of each other, but one was set back of the other, so they wouldn't get entangled with each other. And besides, did they really have assistants like that? Luda, some say Levi, but either Luda, a person from Lud, said, Ish mimalachta asher hema osim, each person according to the work that they were doing. Each person was doing their own work, and they were not doing anybody else's work. In other words, everybody had their own jobs. They were doing the work by themselves. And besides, even if you say that that's the source of throwing, but how do you know that carrying 4 amos in a public domain is going to be transgression? Ella, rather we know that indeed carrying from a public domain to a private domain to a public domain, that we saw in the work of the Mishkan. But carrying 4 amos in a public domain, that's not that isn't its own domain, and that we don't see in the Mishkan, but rather it's logical. As the Ran explains at the beginning in the Masechta, in the Mishnah, that talks about the 39 malachas. The Ran explains that really we have a concept throughout Shas that every person, his space is 4 amos. So wherever I am, 4 amos around me is considered my halachic space. I can even acquire something in a public domain, if I'm standing there and something is put in my 4 amos, that can be considered mine. So there is a concept of 4 amos being personal space. Obviously, people have a right, it's a right of way, so other people can walk into that space as well. And if they're there as well, then I couldn't necessarily acquire something. But the concept is that a personal space is 4 amos. And therefore, if there's an object here and I move it 4 amos to another place, now I've moved it out of its original of personal or private space, even though it's in the public domain. So that's the concept. And to tell us that throwing and carrying would count as under this category of malacha, the kol daled amos b'shus harabim gemara gemirila. All carrying in a public domain counts is halacha l'moshe Sinai. It's not similar to something in the Mishkan, but it is a halacha l'moshe Sinai that accounts under this understanding that there is a personal space within a public domain of 6 feet, of 4 amos. Tomorrow we'll continue with this Gemara about who and what the Makoshesh was.